I grew up in a chaotic world where even the strongest bonds were shattered by betrayal and heartbreak. My life's journey took an early, brutal twist when my beloved father, a man of immense kindness and generosity, passed away, leaving behind not only cherished memories but also the family home he had meticulously bequeathed to me through his deathbed will. Almost immediately after his passing, my own mother, driven by a desperate need to impress her new husband and establish her own redefined family, made the heart-wrenching decision to remove me from the only home I had ever known. Instead of allowing me to grieve in the comfort of that familiar place, she forced me into a new life under the roof of my paternal grandparents. And before we continue with this tumultuous tale, please remember to subscribe, like, and share for support of my channel. Your encouragement truly helps me share these raw, personal stories with the world. At a tender age, only 7 years old, I was forced to confront the devastation of losing my father. I still recall that agonizing moment when I watched him being lowered into a coffin, the image seared into my memory forever, a bittersweet farewell that left me feeling hollow and abandoned. As I struggled to come to terms with my grief, my mother reappeared in my life bearing a new man and insisting that I immediately address him as Dad. The proposal felt both rushed and utterly foreign to my tender heart. How could I possibly embrace someone new so soon after my father's untimely departure? My instincts told me that something was profoundly wrong. Within just a few months of that fateful loss, I began noticing that this stranger was frequently present in my mother's private spaces, especially her bedroom, a constant reminder of how swiftly she had attempted to replace the man I loved without so much as a pause for mourning. When I had barely turned 8, my mother arranged a lavish wedding celebration, a so-called second wedding that was both extravagant and, in my eyes, deeply inappropriate. Instead of allowing me to remain close to the memories of my true father, she left me in the care of my paternal grandparents while she dashed off on her honeymoon. Days turned into weeks, and I eagerly awaited her return, constantly asking my grandparents when she would finally come back for me. Their answers were vague, adding to the mounting confusion and loneliness I felt. Then, one day, the moment I had longed for arrived, my mother finally reappeared. I rushed forward, bursting with excitement and hope to embrace her after such a long separation, only to have my belongings hastily gathered and dumped off at my grandparents' doorstep, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. The betrayal cut deeply, and though I continued living with my grandparents throughout my childhood and even into my high school years, I could never shake the sting of being discarded by the very person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. Despite sporadic visits from my mother, during which she would recite empty declarations of love and concern, her actions always spoke louder than her words. Whenever I questioned her about why she abandoned me at my grandparents' house despite professing so much love, she would deflect with absurd explanations, that my aging grandparents needed help with their groceries and trash, for instance. Only much later did the grim truth emerge. She had actually given away my room to her stepchildren, a couple of kids from her new husband Bill's previous marriage, completely prioritizing her new family over my well-being. It was only natural that resentment began to fester inside me, a slow-burning anger that eventually made me stop seeking her approval altogether. After high school, I left my grandparents' home, although I still visit them frequently, for they were the true saviors of my childhood, a sanctuary that shielded me from the ruin that my mother's indifference could have wrought. Now, at the age of 24 and armed with a year's experience in the marketing world, I decided to embark on a new venture, one that required capital. My solution? To lease out the very house that, unbeknownst to my mother and her new family, legally belonged to me. Yes, that same house, passed down to me by my father through his rigorously detailed will, which clearly stated that every penny he owned, including the cherished family home, was mine and would remain untouched until I turned 21. I was only a child when his lawyer solemnly read out his will at the funeral, and I still remember the cold, displeased look that crossed my mother's face. Over the years, I discovered that she had made several attempts to overturn that will, but each time she was thwarted by the precision of my father's final instructions. So, when I called her last month to inform her of my plans to lease the house for some much-needed capital, my calls went unanswered. Later that week, a visit to my grandparents revealed that my mother's family might fiercely resist vacating the house. Complications included her stepdaughter, who was not only pregnant but also involved with a teenage boy who had irresponsibly run away from his duties, and Bill, who had lost his full-time job and was now scrimping by with an evening shift at a local store. Financial hardship seemed to have settled over them like a dark cloud, leaving me torn between the need for my own fresh start and the looming legal and emotional battles that lay ahead. As the drama escalated, my grandparents warned me that my mother and her family were in a particularly rough patch, suggesting that I might have to brace myself for strong resistance when trying to reclaim my house. I initially considered giving them a month's notice to vacate, but given their desperate situation, I eventually decided to extend that period to 3 or 4 months. Hoping to speak with her directly, I once again ventured to her home, a place that had lost its former warmth. The house, now cold and unwelcoming, seemed to mirror the woman who greeted me at the door with a forced smile and a half-hearted hug. We hadn't seen each other for nearly a decade. After I entered my teenage years, she stopped visiting me altogether, and understandably, bitterness had taken root in my heart. Our brief reunion was devoid of any genuine interest in my well-being. She merely acknowledged my presence as if I were an unimportant obligation. Even my pregnant stepsister glared at me with disdain, as if my very arrival was meant to cause trouble. Disheartened, I abandoned the idea of reclaiming my house at that moment and began searching for alternative ways to fund my business. Then came a fateful week that only deepened the wound. Last week marked the 15th anniversary of my father's passing, and my devoted grandparents organized a small, heartfelt prayer ceremony at the local church in his memory. Since I happened to be in town, I decided to honor his legacy in a more public way, by feeding the poor and handing out gifts to underprivileged children as part of the ceremony. I even took the time to invite friends, relatives, and, in a gesture of cautious hope, my mother via email. To my dismay, when I later checked, I discovered that she had not even opened the message, a clear sign that I was still not a priority in her life. Assuming that perhaps the email had mistakenly landed in her spam folder, I decided to visit her house once more. This time, however, the door was answered not by my estranged mother but by my stepsister Brenda, whose curt, almost hostile greeting, "You're back again, what's the matter?" cut me deeply. When I explained that I was there to invite my mother to my father's prayer ceremony, Brenda scoffed, remarking in a tone so dismissive that it left me speechless. I retorted that my father's memory was sacred, and it wasn't up for her to belittle. In a fit of anger, I sarcastically told her, "Yeah, of course, they're your top priority. After all, we're nothing to you. Good luck raising that narcissistic woman and her bastard child." My word struck a nerve. She immediately erupted, furious that I would use such harsh language. In response, my mother defended herself by claiming it was natural for her to be furious, insisting that I was insensitive for even mentioning my father's death in the presence of a pregnant woman, comparing me unfavorably to him. That comment was the final straw. I exploded with anger, vehemently denouncing her for trash-talking my deceased father. "If anyone here is insensitive, it's you," I bellowed, my voice trembling with raw emotion. She coldly replied, "Your father died 15 years ago, get over it," as if the passage of time should erase the pain. I retorted that perhaps she would eventually get over it, but not before facing the consequences of her true colors. That very day, I enlisted a lawyer and initiated the process of serving a legal eviction notice. After about 15 long days of legal back and forth to validate my father's will, the notice was finally sent to my mother. As expected, the notice sent her into a state of panic. Apparently, she had never imagined I would go to such extreme lengths to exact revenge for her neglect, especially after she had so callously snubbed my invitation to my father's prayer ceremony. I couldn't help but laugh at the voicemail she left me, and I promptly blocked her number, severing the communication lines that had long been a source of pain. Not long after, my mother even showed up unannounced at my grandparents' home, though I wasn't there at the time. For now, I've returned to live with my grandparents while I work to rebuild my life. My mother desperately pleaded with them to convince me to withdraw the eviction notice, but my grandparents, ever calm and just, insisted that the property was legally mine and that I had every right to do as I wished. In a moment of bitter defiance, my mother even accused my grandparents of raising me to be an entitled brat. I couldn't believe her audacity. What was she thinking? When I asked my grandmother why she hadn't confronted my narcissistic mother sooner, she simply replied that dealing with such a volatile woman was not something they wished to engage in. I declared that I was no longer willing to let them, these self-absorbed, sure-headed people, remain in my house for even one more day. I served the eviction notice in accordance with tenant laws, even though they weren't paying any rent, and reminded everyone that I was the one paying the property taxes every year. Legally, I was entitled to reclaim my property immediately. My God-fearing grandparents, though compassionate, urged me to extend a 1-month grace period so that the pregnant woman in the household wouldn't be left destitute. I sighed at the irony. She didn't need any help either, for she was just as toxic. Eventually, they convinced me to wait, despite my burning desire to see them all removed that very day. The very next day, my mother called. I ignored the call. When she texted, insisting that we talk urgently, I checked my schedule and agreed to meet at my grandparents' house during an open time slot. This meeting, however, quickly descended into another painful encounter. My mother's lengthy message accused me of trying to throw my weight around, 5 paragraphs of blame and recrimination that I chose not to respond to, understanding that she was simply trying to pressure me into submission. Throughout my childhood, whenever I'd cry or throw tantrums out of longing for a loving home, she would berate me and demand that I behave, using fear and intimidation as her parenting style. That method had worked to silence me then, but now it only fueled my resolve. I decided that it was finally time for her to suffer the same loneliness and bitterness I had endured for so long. At our meeting, I made her wait for an entire hour before speaking, an hour that seemed to stretch on painfully as she grew increasingly anxious. When I finally arrived, she glared at me as if to say, "Where the hell have you been? I've been waiting for an hour." Yet, she said nothing. Instead, she simply sat there with a steely, unyielding expression. Finally, in a clipped tone, she announced, "I can't sit here forever, I have jobs to do." Under my breath, I murmured, "Oh sure, you do, finding a house is no easy job either." Irritated, she demanded to know what the eviction notice was about. I told her it was written in English, sarcastically asking if she needed me to read it aloud for her. Enraged, she flung the notice in my face and declared that she would never vacate the house over some stupid notice. After her tirade, I calmly warned, "Then let's wait and see the repercussions of not following the court order." In response, she spat out, "I gave birth to you, don't you try to outsmart me. That house is my husband's, and no one can throw me out." I retorted, "A legal order is a legal order." My calm tone was only meant to infuriate her further. But when she referred to my late father as her husband, I lost all semblance of restraint. "How dare you call him your husband?" I roared. "After you skipped his prayer and treated him as if he were nothing more than a relic of the past, you have no right to claim his house. You're nothing but squatters, and I'm going to free that house from all you leeches." She shot up to her feet, declaring that she had been kind to me and that I would soon have to contend with her lawyer. I merely laughed and said, "We still have 20 days, let's see what you do next." Update 2 came swiftly. After a relentless legal tussle, I finally regained control of the house. I gave a 30-day notice to my mother and her family to vacate the premises. In her desperation, she attempted to gaslight me, but I shut her down immediately. The events that followed were a showcase of their sheer narcissism. Could you believe it? Her stepdaughter Brenda charged at me, threatening to press charges for harassment, playing the pregnancy victim card as if being pregnant gave her a free pass to act out. I told her plainly that pregnancy was not a ticket to escape accountability. When she tried to cause trouble for my grandparents, I made sure to remind her that I had installed a security camera across the house. "One more step, and I'm calling the police," I warned. Soon after, my mother arrived to defend her golden stepdaughter, accusing me of abusing and mentally torturing pregnant Brenda and even threatening to sue me. I calmly replied, "Let the judge decide, especially once the camera footage speaks for itself." Unable to win through force anymore, she began to break down, sobbing and questioning what she had done wrong in raising me such that I'd become so self-centered. In a twist of bitter irony, she dragged my dead father into the conversation, blaming him for his early death and the subsequent lack of proper upbringing. I countered, "If anyone is to be blamed, it's you. I wasn't raised by you, I was raised by my grandparents, who did a far better job. You abandoned me on my birthdays, at Christmas, on Thanksgiving, you barely ever showed up, and when you did, it was as if you were doing me a favor. What kind of mother are you? I even brought up the scandal of your stepdaughter's teen pregnancy, though I knew I shouldn't have indulged in moral policing in the heat of anger." Naturally, this infuriated her further. Realizing I had overstepped a boundary, I eventually fell silent, insisting that I only wanted my property back. After all, I had allowed them to live there rent-free for far too long, and I had quit my job to raise enough capital for my business. When I explained that leasing the house would simply bring in money from paying strangers, she exploded again, accusing me of turning our family matters into a money-making scheme. I shot back bitterly, "There isn't any family here, just a pile of garbage that you threw me away like, without so much as a care on my birthdays, Christmas, or Thanksgiving. Even when you did show up, you made it seem like you were doing me a favor. What kind of mother does that? A mother like you, that's what." She tried every trick in the book, manipulation, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, and her signature outbursts of anger, but I refused to back down. Just when I thought they had finally vacated the house, my mother's loser husband reared his ugly head. That sure-headed man left me a voicemail dripping with threats. You don't know who you're messing with. I could deadlift you, make you beg for mercy, and one punch to your face will make you forget about the house. If you show up at my door again, I'm going to knock you out. I wasn't about to let his bluster go unanswered, but I also knew that my grandparents had warned me against messing with him. He was a bully, albeit a dumb one. His voicemail, filled with self-incriminating evidence of his own aggression, only confirmed my resolve. I chose not to respond immediately. Instead, I waited for someone bigger and more capable to handle him. On the scheduled day of eviction, I went to the police station to register a case for the threats. Armed with solid evidence and accompanied by my lawyer, I convinced the cops to come along to the house. Initially, the police were reluctant, saying, "Call us if they cause trouble," but a little cash helped secure their cooperation. When we arrived, my mother, Bill, and Brenda started cussing and shouting at us, and her loser husband even emerged brandishing a hockey stick. But the moment he saw the police vehicle behind our car, he stepped back. The cops presented the eviction notice and demanded that they leave immediately. They were so sure of their ability to chase me out that they hadn't even bothered to pack their belongings. They pleaded for an extra month's time, citing Brenda's pregnancy, but I stood firm. The police, noticing my unwavering determination, agreed only to a mere 3 hours of additional time. Amid bitter glares and furious gestures, including Bill trying to shoulder me with red, enraged eyes, the cops eventually corralled them out of the house. At the station, they handed over the keys, and although we had to pay extra to expedite the process, it was a small price to pay to be free of those squatters. My lawyer even suggested taking out a restraining order against them on the property to prevent any further harassment, and we did just that. The stark expressions on their faces as they received the order said it all. Finally, I had reclaimed the house, and I promptly put it up for lease with the hope of securing a lucrative deal to jumpstart my business. I declared that I was done dealing with those sure-headed people. This update would likely be my last, unless they decide to return and cause more chaos. Now, as if the turmoil with my family wasn't enough, fate had another brutal twist in store, one that involved my high school sweetheart. I discovered that the woman I had been with for 8 long, cherished years had been cheating on me with her college professor. I am a 25-year-old male, and learning that my girlfriend, who was also 25, had betrayed me in such a deeply personal way left me utterly shocked and heartbroken. We had been high school sweethearts, practically inseparable since childhood. We'd played together on sunny afternoons, grown up side by side, and as we reached our teenage years, we became each other's first love. Our relationship was the kind that everyone admired. We were voted the best couple year after year during high school, and everyone believed that we were destined to be together forever. After she gained admission to an esteemed Ivy League college in our state, a place where my academic achievements paled in comparison, I took a job at a real estate firm, planning to eventually get my license once I had a better grasp of the industry. Despite the distance, we managed to see each other on weekends. Yet, even then, a nagging insecurity began to gnaw at me. I worried that coming from humble beginnings, she might someday realize that she could do better and simply leave me behind. I even feared that once she was immersed in the lavish lifestyle and privileged circles of her prestigious institution, some rich, charming lacrosse player might sweep her off her feet. Her constant reassurances made me feel better, but the doubt lingered. As time passed, after she graduated with her undergraduate degree, the college offered her a coveted faculty position that allowed her to pursue a graduate degree without incurring any cost, a dream opportunity she couldn't refuse, even though it meant prolonged separation. In her new role, she assisted a prominent professor with his research, a man who commanded great respect in his field and had an entire team of students doing the heavy lifting while he took all the credit. At first, I assumed her admiration for him was merely professional. However, I soon began noticing that every conversation we had was dominated by praise for this professor, as if he were the lead singer of a rock band and her personal hero. Then, one day, while skimming through a newsletter from her college, I saw a photograph that made my heart sink. In the midst of a candid article highlighting the department's research, there was an image of her with the professor, his hand resting casually on her lower back. While some might dismiss such a gesture as innocuous, to me it was a glaring red flag, an unmistakable sign that things were not as they seemed. Shortly after that discovery, I called her and asked directly about the photograph. Instead of offering a sincere explanation, she laughed and dismissed my concerns, claiming I was simply insecure, as if my feelings were always unfounded. The conversation escalated into a bitter argument that lasted for hours. For 2 long days, we didn't speak, and eventually, I caved in, calling her to apologize in a futile attempt to restore peace between us. It seemed that everything might return to normal, especially with our anniversary approaching. We had planned for her to take an entire weekend off so we could spend quality time together. But midway through my journey to her apartment, she called to say that she couldn't leave the lab. I pulled over on the side of the road, expressing how deeply disappointed I was that she wouldn't stand up for our relationship on such an important occasion. She promised to make it up to me the following weekend and told me to simply turn around and go home. Since I was much closer to her apartment than to my own, I continued on, hoping that I could salvage some semblance of a shared evening, perhaps by ordering some takeout and spending a few hours together before departing. When I finally arrived at her apartment, I used the spare key I had to unlock the door, expecting to be greeted by the familiar comfort of her presence. Instead, I was immediately struck by the rich aroma of freshly prepared food and the sound of light, almost mischievous giggling emanating from her bedroom. As I ventured further in, I noticed evidence of a recently prepared meal, a table set with 2 plates and a half-empty bottle of wine left behind. My heart sank deeper with each step, and as I reached the door to her bedroom, my worst fears were confirmed. I slowly opened the door to find her in bed with her professor, locked in a moment of intimacy that shattered the remnants of my trust. They didn't notice me at first, but when I finally spoke up and demanded to know what was happening, he leaped off her in a panic while she scrambled to calm me down. It was almost absurd how hard he tried to hide his shame, desperately attempting to cover up what had clearly transpired. Overwhelmed by hurt and betrayal, I stormed out of her apartment, my spare key dropping onto the ground as I left behind a part of my shattered past, vowing never to return. The days that followed were a blur of numbness and sorrow. I felt as if I had lost not only the woman I once envisioned marrying but also the future we had dreamed about, a future filled with love, shared memories, and even the possibility of children. Instead of a lifelong romance to tell our grandchildren about, I was left with a bitter reminder of betrayal and heartbreak. In the midst of my despair, I realized that I needed to reclaim my power, even if it meant exacting revenge. Aware that the professor was desperate to keep his reputation intact and fearful of losing his job, I decided to take action. I contacted the relevant department at his university and reported what I had witnessed. Initially, they warned me that it would be my word against his, and without any concrete evidence, my claims might be dismissed. A week passed with nothing happening, and I grew convinced that the scandal was being swept under the rug. Desperate for justice, I then reached out to a local newspaper, and soon enough, the story exploded in the headlines. It wasn't long before I saw the news. The professor had been fired from his position, his career in tatters. The fallout for my ex was equally severe. Without her professor's job to support her, she was forced to either shell out tens of thousands of dollars for her graduate degree or drop out entirely. Ultimately, she was left with no choice but to withdraw from the program. In the aftermath of all this, she is completely out of my life, and here I stand single, uncertain of how to move on from the loss of the first and only woman I ever truly loved. In sharing these deeply personal and excruciatingly painful chapters of my life, I hope you can see just how complex and heart-wrenching family dynamics and romantic betrayals can be. Both the bitter saga of reclaiming my rightful home and the devastating collapse of a once beautiful relationship have taught me lessons in resilience, self-worth, and the cost of neglect and deceit. While I continue to build a new future, one where my property is finally mine and my business dreams may yet be realized, the scars of the past remain as constant reminders of the betrayal I endured. Thank you for reading this long, unfiltered account of my life and for standing by me through these turbulent times. Your support means more than you know, so please, subscribe, like, and share this video to help me spread my story and, perhaps, offer solace to others facing similar battles.